We're going to do a talk with an activity. We're very excited to have him after planning this event a year ago. It was going to be in person, but obviously we can't gather in a room with 50 to 60 people at this time. So now we are online together. If you were not aware, we are the Service Design Network New York chapter, and our chapter is one of actually 45 other chapters. It's all volunteer run, and there are a lot of different benefits and values for being a part of the Service Design Network. All our events are primarily free. You can join them. You don't have to be a member, but there are a ton of benefits if you become a member of the Service Design Network, as you can see on this screen. And our events are the second Tuesday of every month. You'll see them announced about a week before, and keep a lookout on Meetup. We also have a variety of different social media channels that I'll mention toward the end to keep up with that. But I'd say follow us or subscribe through Meetup, and you can see when our events are coming. Kathleen, would you like to talk about our new community one-on-one chats?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I laugh because when you say new, I was like, yeah, it's still pretty new, even though we've been doing it for a few months, I guess. So this one-on-one chat thing, it's an initiative that we started, I think, sometime around the holiday. We realized that those community events are great, but those one-on-one connection is something that that's really special. So we started this initiative, started with Calendly. We put our availabilities in Calendly and drop it in the Meetup, what is it called? The Meetup board, discussion board. Yeah, sorry guys, it's a long day today, but discussion board. So then if you guys are interested in chatting with us on any topic you like, all service design related, or just getting to know us, you can go to our discussion board and find a link and schedule time with us. And I believe some of you have also been reaching out to us directly, and that works as well. Or if you want to drop your availability in the discussion board, that's also welcome too. And we'll see how it goes, and let us know what you guys think, or you have other ways of engagement that you recommend. So yeah, that's all. One-on-one chats.
Yes, anyone can contribute. So anyone can host their Calendly. Another new thing, this is actually new as of today, we are going to be launching these community spotlights on our Instagram. And so we're going to feature different members of the community, just asking them a simple question: why do you come to our events? Why are you engaged with this community? And we're hoping that in this digital time, it's a little bit difficult to really see and feel like you're connected. So we're hoping that this allows us to really spotlight all the different folks who join and engage with us, and that you can better see one another. So we will be giving you more information about that. We have some folks that we're going to share in the next week, but be on the lookout, and keep in mind if you would like to be in the spotlight, it's open to anyone. So we'll follow up, and yeah, more to come on our Instagram. Follow us. Also, more kind of new things. We have had a website for a while. It's the sdnnyc.com. And that's just a place where we host all of our video recordings, our recaps, any information that the speaker wants to leave behind. It's really a centralized place for us to collect all those things. So take a look at that. We have a YouTube channel now. Before, our videos were kind of sporadically hosted throughout, but now they're all centralized on our YouTube channel. So I highly recommend taking a look at that. It's Service Design Network New York chapter, or SDN New York chapter. Here's a picture of our website just so you understand how to orient yourself. If you go down to the community section, you can see these thumbnails a little bit lower down on the page of all the events that we've ever hosted. So it does go back to even the very first event we've ever hosted. If you want to look through the archives, you click on each one of the thumbnails and you can take a look at all the event content. We'll have one after this event as well. And here's what our YouTube channel looks like. So again, this has all of the recordings since the pandemic began. That's when we started recording events. So you can take a look there if you want to refresh your memory, watch any of our older videos. And finally, follow us on social media. We would love to have a conversation with you online. So feel free to use any of these tags. Feel free to follow us, mention us if you see something you like. That's another way we're trying to stay connected with folks throughout this time. And finally, our last housekeeping is be sure to rate us through Meetup. I know we've been mentioning this for the last 3 years, but we do look at the numbers and we do look at what folks wanted to hear and why. And so please give us a rating. You'll get an email from Meetup, I believe, and you can tell us what you liked or did not like about the event. And without further ado, I'm going to hand off screen sharing to Sean. I'm super excited to have him here. Again, we talked about having this event live a year ago, if you can believe it, but it looks like it might be another while before we can do events in person in real life. So we're lucky to have him tonight remotely, or we're a lot of us are in New York, but happy to have you, Sean. I will hand off the microphone and screen sharing to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm honored to be able to talk to all of you. As Natalie said, it's been a crazy year. And although we can't be in a room together, I'm sure a lot of us, I'm sure a lot of us have learned a lot over the last year. So here's some of the things that I've been kind of like reading about and thinking about. Everyone can see my screen all good? Yep. Awesome. Yep. So today
we are seeing your presenter
I think
view.
you're, yeah.
Oh, you're seeing the presenter mode?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. You would think after a year we would have this sorted out, you know. Okay, desktop 2. Let's try this one. Sorry about that.
Gives people a chance to think about if they want to be in the community spotlight. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, are we good? Are we seeing that change?
Got it. Yeah.
All good.
Awesome. So yes, my name is Sean. I was originally born in Australia. I moved to New York about 1.5 years ago. That's where I actually got in contact with the service design community. And it was really awesome to meet up with Natalie and to meet up with Antonio and Kathleen and everyone and get to know them. And although obviously it's been a while since we've seen you all, it's been great that this has continued. So definitely keep coming to these events as much as you can and try to get involved as much as you can, because it was definitely very helpful for me when I first moved to the city, and I'm sure for people who are now entering into the industry and into the community, it's only going to be even more helpful and beneficial to them. So today we're here to talk about creating memorable experiences and memorable moments. We're gonna, as Natalie said, I'm gonna be talking quite a bit today, but we do have some activities to go through. So get a pen and paper out. I will ask you to comment in the chat a little bit, but feel free to you know, keep pens, papers, post-it notes, whatever you need. So I wanted to start off with this date, and this date's kind of important to me for a few reasons. One, it is my birthday, I suppose. It was my birthday in 2019, but it was also the date that I was sitting in a state government department in Australia as a consultant, and I was working on a third-party insurance scheme, designing interactive PDFs for their new third-party insurance program. Now, if that doesn't just make you more excited than anything, I don't know what will. And the reason this is a kind of an important date to me is because as a student studying industrial design, which is what I originally kind of came into the industry through, I had this vision of doing human-centered design in the way that, you know, I was looked up to IDEO doing, you know, changing the way that people interacted with their environments, changing the way that they interacted with systems and services in the world. And then I was like, wow, I'm just designing interactive PDFs. And this is kind of like what I felt like I was doing, right? I kind of felt like I was going around to different client offices and I was fixing potholes. And I was like, I wanted to do more. But the reality is I worked as a consultant and I needed a job and I needed to continue doing this. But I said to myself, kind of resolved to myself on this date that I was going to start a personal growth pathway, that I was going to go out and try to learn a little bit about how we can create memories or experiences for people that kind of transcend the everyday. And so that led me to these 2 books. It led me to a number of books, but these 2 books really stood out. And I think that they dovetailed together really nicely. So the first one is called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. For those who are not aware of Chip and Dan Heath, I highly recommend all of their books. They are phenomenal. But this one in particular is really interesting because what they say, and I've got a couple quotes down there, is that our lives are measured in moments, and are defined, and And defining moments are the ones that endure in our memories. And there's this really amazing quote that I love and that stuck with me for a long, long time, which is that experiences are mostly forgettable and occasionally remarkable. And whenever I'm in there and I'm trying to design things for people, I think to myself, is this going to make their life better? And sometimes it's not necessarily going to make their life fundamentally better to making it more frictionless. But I think, is this something that they're going to remember for the rest of their lives? And it's something that I'm now trying to bring into my practice, even if it's just an anecdotal idea that I throw in on a project. The other book is a book by Fred Lee called If Disney Ran Your Hospital. And Fred Lee was essentially executive for a number of different hospital networks in the United States. He was struggling to inspire his nurses, doctors, custodians, staff members to adopt a customer-centric mentality. And he said, well, who does that the best in the world? Disney. So he went to the Disney Academy, he studied there. And then this book is really his recount of trying to bring back those principles, those ideas that he had learned at the Disney Academy into different hospitals that he worked at. And what's really interesting is he says, companies stage experiences whenever they engage with customers, connecting them in a personal or memorable way. And the reason I love this book is because I love experience measurement. It's really one of the things that I have been passionate about over the course of a number of years, and I continue to kind of practice it and to try to teach companies about how they can do it better. So definitely leave a review about this afterwards. But he says that satisfaction is fool's gold. And I think this is really interesting because it's what Fred puts forward is that it's not about creating satisfactory experiences, it's about creating amazing experiences. And that's what people are going to remember. And so I wanted to introduce an idea to some of you. I'm not sure if it's actually new, but it's definitely something that I want you to all think about as we go through this talk. And this is the peak end rule. So Barbara Fredrickson and Dan Kahneman, two very well-known behavioral economists, a number of years came up with this theory called the peak end rule. And what they say is that our memory of an event is shaped by the highest or lowest moment and the end. All right, so if you imagine you're a customer going through an experience, it could be you or it could be a customer going through your experiences, and you're constantly going through what they call kind of mountains, peaks, and valleys. And you have these peak moments, you have these negative peak moments, which are called pits, and then you have the end of an experience. And the reason that this is kind of interesting is because what they found is when people assess an experience, they tend to forget its length. And this is something called duration neglect, right? So when you look back on really impactful experiences in your life, maybe it's the day that you graduated from college, you may remember the moment that you stood up on stage, or the moment that you saw your family after standing up on stage, or having dinner with them, right? But there's so many of those in-between moments that you just forget because they don't stand out to you in any particular way. And so in the book, this is kind of the first activity that I'm going to ask people to comment in the chat about. Imagine that you are the CEO, maybe you are the CEO, but imagine that you're a CEO right now of the company that you work at, and you have a magic wand. You have the opportunity to raise all your customers who have given you kind of 1s, 2s, and 3s in satisfaction surveys directly up to a 4, so up to that neutral level. Or you can raise all your neutrals up to a 6 or a 7. In the chat, I'm interested, how would all of you respond to this? I can get to it. Let's see. There we go. Neutrals to 6. Yeah, I mean, the name of the talk kind of gives us away a little bit. So yes, it is. I'm just hoping the chat, so let me move around a little bit. So it's really interesting that customers who give you a 6 or a 7 rather than a 1 or a 2, right, are 9 times more likely to, are 9 times more valuable to organizations, right? But as designers and as people working in different organizations, for every 1 hour that we spend on customers who have given you a 1 or a 2, we spend 15 minutes on customers who give you a 6 or a 7. So we're spending a disproportionately large amount of time on customers who actually aren't worth that much to our company, just because as humans, we're better at fixing problems, I think, than we are at trying to fix things that aren't necessarily broken or trying to create these peak experiences. Another interesting statistic, this is from the Harvard Business Review. All of you would have seen this in your life in many different forms. You probably run this at the company that you work at. How satisfied are you with an experience? What they found, and admittedly this study is from a number of years ago, but what they found is that for customers who give you a 4 rather than a 5 on a satisfaction survey, they're 6 times more likely to defect. And so when you think about this idea of satisfaction being fool's gold, it's that we're measuring in some ways the wrong thing. What Disney does, which I think is really interesting, is they don't actually put the number of customers who give a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 up to their staff members. They show the percentage of customers who give a 5. That's all they care about, right? And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at things. It's like we only want to create these memorable experiences that people will never forget. And so hopefully through this, what I've kind of convinced you is that peak moments matter, right? Is that like we should be focusing on these. But as designers, I think we're trained and we're often put in situations where we're trying to fix problems rather than build these memorable experiences. And so I'm going to tell you a number of different stories today. Here's kind of the first one. This story is from a man named Doug Dietz. He was a designer for General Electric. And this is one of my favorite stories of human-centered design. This is actually what kind of got me into service design in the first place. And Doug was an industrial designer working for General Electric a number of years ago. And they said to him, you know, we need to redesign our MRI scanner, our MRI machine. It's just due for an overhaul. So being an industrial designer, he was very excited about this opportunity. It's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. So he brought together scientists, engineers, technicians, you know, all really smart people. And over the course of 2 years, they redesigned this MRI machine. And he recounts this story, and I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in hearing him tell it. It's on YouTube as a TED Talk. It's about 20 minutes and it's phenomenal. It's really, really moving. And as he retells the story, he says the first day that this MRI scanner went into a hospital, he actually went to go see it used, and he went and he was talking to the technician, and he talks about how he felt like a proud parent. And the technician says to him, you know, we actually have a patient coming. If you want, you can just leave the room. We'll let them get settled, and then you can watch with me from the operating room, from behind the glass window. And he's like, oh, I'd love to. So he steps out of the room and he looks down the hallway, still really proud and really excited, and he sees a young girl walking down the hallway with her 2 parents holding hands and they're kind of on either side of her. And as they get closer, he realizes that this girl is distraught. She's crying, she's shaking, she's sweating. And the father bends down to her and gives her a hug and says, we've spoken about this, you can be brave. And Doug's kind of like starting to get a little bit nervous. And he's like, what's going on here? And he follows the family in because he's so intrigued. And he said he kind of stooped down to the level of this young girl, and he saw the hospital room for something that he'd never seen it before. He saw the radiation sign and the exclamation mark on the wall. He saw the red and black tape on the ground. He saw the flickering fluorescent lights. He saw how sterile it looked, and he saw how scary it was. And in that moment, he kind of made a personal resolution where he said, this is not going to be my legacy. I'm going to go and fix this. And so he went out, and instead of bringing in scientists and technicians, he brought in children's museum directors, parents, clowns, children. He brought in a group of different people. He did bring in technicians as well, so that he was designing kind of a functioning system. But he said to them, we can't really change the design of this MRI scanner. It needs to look like this weird spaceship looking thing. But what else can we do to make this a better experience for children? And so what they ended up coming up with what's now called the GE Adventure series. And it's a series of different themed rooms in hospitals around, I think it's just in the United States at the moment, but it could be international, I could be wrong. And what they did is they redesigned the experience around getting an MRI scan. So as a child, you now have the opportunity to go in beforehand, and you can bring your favorite toy or teddy and you put it through a mini MRI scanner. And they talk to you about the process and about what's going to happen. And when you go in on the day, you can see there's there's these rooms that have been designed by children for children, and the kids, as he says, they kind of jump on those stones to get to the MRI scanner, and they have machines that produce different types of scents, and they have lights that change color. And the bed, as it goes down, it goes into a canoe, and the children climb onto the bed, and they say to them, you know, if you lie really still, really, really still, you can see the fish jump over you during the scan. And he says that all the kids, like the first time he saw them do it, lay like still as a board. And this didn't just provide a better experience, which it did, as you can imagine, but interestingly, 80% of children had to get sedated before MRI scans. Only 2% of children have to get sedated while they take MRI scans with this experience. It's crazy. So it actually had a huge impact on the hospital system and on the health of these young children. And to kind of sum it all up, he tells in his story this moment that he was standing with a parent after watching her daughter just go through, I think it was the pirate room. And he's standing there talking to this parent about his experience going through this design process, and the daughter's tugging on the mother's shirt. And the mother looks down and says, honey, what is it? And she goes, can we come back tomorrow? And when Doug tells the story in the YouTube video, he starts crying. He was like, this is a moment that as a human, as a designer, as a person, you kind of live for your entire life. And he turned to the technician who was standing next to him, who was crying as well. And this technician is actually like his client in many ways. And he apologizes to her and he says, I'm really sorry, I'm kind of made you cry, or that you started crying. And she said, no, you just reminded me why I got into medicine in the first place, because I wanted to help children. And I think what's really interesting about this story is that he understood kind of the ebbs and flows in the experience. He knew and he recognized that there were certain things that weren't going to be able to change. But he said, how do we look at, and this is a kind of an ecosystem diagram I use quite often, but you have a product, an experience, a service, and then a set of communications that sit around that in kind of a concentric circle, right? And he was like, let's just pretend like the product is something that we can't change. Let's try change everything around it. And it's one of those stories that for me, I think it's something that I always try to think back to is, if we couldn't change the thing at its core, if we couldn't change the product, how can we change everything that sits around it? And so, as I said, I highly recommend you watch the video because he can tell it far better than I can. He's far more articulate. But I wanted to caveat all of this because a lot of you are probably thinking, well, you know, there's just times in the experience that I own or that I'm designing that things are going to go wrong. And this is ridiculous that you're telling me not to focus on those moments because I have to, you know, people are going to complain. So what I wanted to caveat this with was that every great service company is great at service recovery. And for those who aren't aware, service recovery is a company's ability to kind of come back from a service failure. It's the action that they take to respond to a break point in the experience. So I'm going to show you a graph. I promise I'll explain it. It's not too scary, but this is what's called the service recovery paradox, right? And I think this is one of the things that I find most interesting. I've been obsessed with this for years, is that if you have two axes, you have customer loyalty as your Y and time as your X, right? If you look at the purple line, that's a customer who's just going through their interactions with you as a brand, right? And over time, they generally increase their loyalty to you because, you know, maybe things go right and wrong, you know, you have a few ups and downs. But what's really interesting is if you look at the orange line, is that if a break point in the experience occurs, obviously there's a dip, right? And how you respond to that has a huge impact on how customers perceive you as a brand. If you respond to that well, if you engage in service recovery, you can actually create more loyalty with a customer than you would have if that had never happened in the first place. So this is about, you know, in industrial design, we talk about turning faults into features, right? And I think this is one of those things. It's like things are going to go wrong. There's no discounting that. There's no getting around that. You know, in every experience we design, there's always going to be an edge case, and someone's going to fall into it, and it's probably going to be the third person who goes through the experience, right? But how you set the system that you set up to catch them and to respond to that has a huge impact on how customers perceive you. So here's a couple of different examples just to bring it to life. A ski resort that had people stuck on a chairlift for a number of hours. When the family got off the chairlift, they had a hot drink, free ski passes for the day, and a meal card waiting for them that they could go to any restaurant at the resort instantaneously. It was the first interaction they had with anyone from the company. It wasn't, oh, you're gonna have to call this number. It was the very first thing that happened. Another really great example, I think, is that a furniture company that made a little boy wait 2 weeks longer than they had promised to get his bed delivered ended up sending a free toy car in the delivery because they knew that they needed to apologize. And you're probably thinking like, oh, why do we need to make a kid happy? They're not going to be a return customer. But I think it's just a really nice example of how, as a company, you can recognize that something could and is probably going to go wrong, and set up systems to try turn that fault into a feature. And you can create peak experiences from that. I'm sure many of you have had experiences with, a telecommunications provider, an insurance provider, a bank, whatever it may be, where something has gone pretty seriously wrong. And just the way that they've responded has made you say, wow, I'm never going to shop with anyone else again, because they did right by me. And I think this is a huge opportunity that people so often overlook. So let's get into it. We'll talk a little bit about how we can create these memorable experiences. Chip and Dan Heath say that they can be created by following the 4 principles. And these are 4 different types of moments, if you will. So you have moments of elevation, moments of insight, moments of pride, and moments of connection, right? And I'm going to tell you a lot of stories today. So I hope you're ready to hear a lot of case studies, because I think that they really exemplify the kind of lessons and behaviors behind what we're trying to do here. So let's kick off. So moments of elevation. These are defining moments that rise above the everyday routine. They provoke not just transient happiness, like laughing at a friend's joke, but memorable delight. And they say that there's 3 separate ways, or 3 different ways that we can address moments of elevation. We can do that by boosting sensory appeal, by raising the stakes, and by breaking the script. And now I'm going to attempt a screen swap onto a YouTube video for all of you. So let's see how we go. After a year, hopefully I've got this down pat. How's that? Yeah. All right. Hopefully you can all hear this. So I'm just going to leave it as it is because it's only a few seconds. Probably all like, what did he just show me? So that is what happens every single year at Mastery Charter Schools in Houston. And this is one of my favorite stories, and it's about boosting sensory appeal, as you can imagine from that video. That's why I really wanted you to watch it and kind of hear the sounds and experience and imagine that you were there, right? So one day, 2 teachers of this Houston-based school we're sitting together watching National Signing Day, which thankfully this is an American audience. I've given this talk in Australia before, and this is like a 10-minute explanation about what this day is. But it's the day, for those who don't know, that high school students sign their binding letter of intent to go to college, to play sport. And they're sitting there watching this after a long day at school, and they say to themselves or to each other, why do we recognize sporting in this way, but we don't recognize academia? Now, these 2 individuals were teaching at a school that predominantly had was educating children from underserved communities, many of whom their parents and their siblings had never gone to college before. And they said, well, what if we had our own college signing day? As I said, for many of these kids, this is a huge moment. This is the first time that anyone in their family had ever signed, had ever got a letter of acceptance to go to college. And so that's exactly what they did. Is they asked the kids who had got accepted into colleges or who had applied to colleges, they said, when you get your letter, don't tell your parents, don't tell your friends, don't tell any of us. Come to the school hall on this day. We're going to invite your parents, your friends, the faculty. We're going to invite people from the local community. We're going to turn it into a pep rally, essentially, right? We're going to get the band to play, the cheerleaders to come. You're going to go on stage, and in front of everyone, you can announce the college that you're going to. What's interesting is that this event ended up growing and growing and growing each year. Even the education secretary, Anne Duncan, ended up attending this event one year. And again, it had this amazing impact of it drove children who wouldn't have thought about going to college to consider it, because they wanted to be a part of this event. They wanted to be a part of this memorable experience that was kind of a once in a lifetime thing. And they did that by having an event that was above and beyond, that had the sights, the sounds, the smells, the people, everything. It boosted sensory appeal. In a similar vein, and I promise this is the only other story that's going to be from a high school. After this, we get into real companies. This one's from Hillsdale High School. And this is kind of similar in a sense that it's about raising the stakes. And again, two teachers are sitting there chatting one day, and they have this weird moment where they think about the analogy of sporting and education. And they say, going to school is very different to playing sport, because when you play sport, you train once or twice a week, and then every weekend you have kind of that peak, that mini peak, where you go and you play a game, and you may win or you may lose, but at least you get to practice those skills that you've been training. And then maybe you have a season that you get to the championship, and then you win, and that's something that you're never going to forget for the rest of your life. And you're training because you actually get this payoff, right? But going to school is like you train, and you train, and then you have this like negative peak. You have this pit moment where you actually have to write an exam, and you get really stressed out, and then you go back to training. And they said, well, like this is ridiculous. How do we create an academic or an educational experience which is as memorable as playing in a tournament with your local football team, or as memorable as going to prom? So what they decided to do is kind of change up an assignment that they did every year. So imagine you're sitting in an English class and you're talking about the book The Lord of the Flies, written by William Golding. And instead of getting the normal essay question that you get, and it says bring back 2,000 words and this question that we're going to ask you, your teacher drops in front of each one of you a thick document, old style document with many, many, many pieces of paper in it. It's got a wax seal on the top of it. And the teacher says to you, each one of you is going to take a role in this trial. You think, kind of thinking to yourself, what are you talking about? And he says, one of you is going to be the judge, one of you is going to be the witness, one of you is going to be the prosecutor, the defense, the attorney, and you all take up a role in this kind of experience. And then the teacher says to you, and not only are we going to do this as a class exercise, and we're going to kind of build your case over the course of the semester, but at the end of the semester, you're going to dress up in a suit, and your parents and the teachers and your classmates are going to come to the local court, and a real judge is going to preside over the case where the two groups present whether or not William Golding presented human nature in an accurate way, or whether or not he was kind of lying in humans having a violent core, if you will. And so what these teachers did is they turned a moment of kind of monotony into a very memorable experience. They raised the stakes to the point that these kids kind of had to participate, because they were going to stand up and they were going to wear a suit for maybe the first time in their life. And this is what it takes sometimes to create a memorable experience, is you have to make things that go above the everyday norm. It can't sit within kind of the monotony of everyday experience. And this is why I love this case study. And this is about breaking the script. This is one by Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines is the low fare airline. That's their MO, right? So whenever they go into a decision over whether they do initiative A or initiative B, they say to themselves, what's going to cost money? And what's going to pass cost onto the consumer? And they will never go with the thing that's going to pass cost onto the consumer, which, if any of you have been in a situation like that where you have to improve an experience and you have no funding to do so, you're like, wow, that's a really difficult thing to do. So they thought about what they had at hand, right? And what Southwest did is they started to encourage their flight attendants to come up with these really interesting, really novel, really creative announcements. Some of you may have seen them again on YouTube. There's a few of them that have gone viral over the last few years. But they actually went out and, as an organization, said, we're going to set up a wall of fame at headquarters in the Southwest headquarters. And they have people's photos and quotes and videos there of when these attendants have told these really, really funny announcements. Because you imagine you go on a flight, like who really listens to the safety announcements? It's such a monotonous experience. You're so used to it that you usually just kind of drown it out with your headphones. And there's a few amazing ones, right? So there's a few phenomenal ways that these flight attendants have kind of taken it upon themselves to create these moments of elevation and to kind of break the script or the monotony of that experience. So here's a couple for those who haven't heard of them, who haven't heard any in the past. So ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to smoke, the smoking section on this airplane is on the wing. And if you can light them, you can smoke them. Or if you should get to use the life vest in a real life situation, the vest is yours to keep. And this is one of my favorite ones is if oxygen masks are to fall, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, then on your child. If you're traveling with more than one child, start with the one who has more potential or who's less likely to put you in a home, right? And it's like, they didn't read, this cost them nothing. All they did is all they had to do is provide a prompt, a spark for these flight attendants to do something different. And you can imagine if you hear that, you kind of take your headphones out and you start laughing and you think to yourself, wow, this is actually like funny. This is something that's a little bit different. Not only is it different, they actually ran analysis on this. And what they found was that customers who heard those announcements were more likely to go back and fly with Southwest again. So it's this really interesting thing where it's like, it seems like a novel experience. And I'm going to say this a lot, it's like, but putting a smile on someone's face goes a long way, you know, because so often things are kind of just this like neutral, kind of mundane. And so any opportunity we have to create a peak, I think we should take. Here's another one that comes from my life. So this is again about breaking up the everyday commute. This is actually a very similar story to the one I just told you. Sydney Trains, I'm from Sydney in Australia. Sydney Trains, which is like the MTA of Sydney, had an opportunity a few years ago to automate all of their train announcements. And they opted not to. They actually opted instead to send every train conductor, every train announcer to a radio host course so that they could practice their announcements and feel confident doing so. And I remember I was on the train one day and I had my headphones in, as everyone does, kind of on the way into work. And I heard this announcement come up and I was like, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sydney Trains. It's an amazing Friday. I hope you're ready for the weekend. It's sunny outside. I'm going to be going fishing. Next stop's Wynyard and then Central Station. And I remember I took my headphones out and I looked around and I had this moment with the people on the train where we were all just laughing and smiling. And I got off the train and somebody walked up to the conductor, to the announcer, and shook their hand and said, thank you, you just made my day. You know, it's like, it's these little things that we can do that kind of just like break up the everyday experience. And for those of you who don't have a train conductor within your experience that you currently own, I thought about another one, which is a little bit more digitally oriented. This is something I've been trying to pitch to clients for many, many years. No one has ever bought. So if any of you can do it, I look forward to the day that I check my banking app and I see a message from one of you. But what about opening up new channels of communication, right? Every time I speak to a customer about how they manage their finances, you get the one type of customer who is like your financially savvy customer who knows everything and knows exactly how much they're going to spend. You have the other type who's like me, who like their version of financial planning is to check their bank statement at the end of a weekend. And usually I'm like wincing when I do it. I'm like, oh no, what have I done? And every time I look at this, I end up going through this process of trying to work out what these expenses are for. And I've always just thought, why doesn't a company just say, you know, like, hey, insurance company, like Liberty Mutual, we've got you covered. You know, like just put in something that breaks up the script. That's a little bit interesting. That puts a smile on your face. I'm glad to be of service, Uber. I think that there's some really interesting opportunities for us as service designers to think about like this is even an emerging channel, right? This is like beyond, this is an old channel, and work with other people within the organization to say like, what can we do to just like help people and meet them where they are? Because everyone checks their bank statement at some point in time. And everyone, if you're like me, you're looking at this and you're like, is that hieroglyphics or is that just a string of numbers and like letters? And I have no idea what that expense is for. And so that kind of brings us through to the end of moments of elevation. And so what I wanted to do is kind of give you a brief. So imagine you're working for me. And what we're going to do is we're going to open a kind of mid-range Australian restaurant in the United States, right? The food's not going to be amazing. It's going to be a little bit better than Outback Steakhouse, but it's not going to be amazing. But I want the experience to be the thing that people are going to come back for. I want people to say, wow, you have to go eat at that restaurant because the experience of being there is something like you haven't had anywhere else, you know? So think about the kind of the stories, the principles, boosting sensory appeal, raising the stakes, and breaking the script. And over the course of the next couple of minutes, just jot some stuff down. If you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, share in the chat. I'd love to hear any ideas that you have to make my Australian restaurant experience stand out. No blooming onions. Oh, and yes, whoever commented in the chat, like Aquafina and the 7 Train, yes, that is a great example of when a company has done that. Well, when the New York City train people did that. Would love to have a koala in the restaurant. Whoever said that. Live stream of Australian landmarks. Just have Bondi Beach up there would be great. The restaurants in the US. So think of every stereotype that you can play on. Just testing Australian stereotypes. It is. Having to order an Australian accent is amazing. Whoever came up with that, I would love to hear everyone's Australian accent. Cool. So I'm gonna jump into a couple. Keep throwing them in because they are amazing. I love these ones. So here's a couple that I thought of. They are by no means great. I think some of yours are probably even better, especially the Australian accent one. I think that would be hilarious. So let's have a look. Boosting sensory appeal. So what if patrons or customers, like first-class airline passengers, before the meal were presented with a steaming hot towel scented with something like eucalyptus oil, or the scent of the Australian outback, something that it actually engages your senses. It fully envelops you in the same way that they usually do that with, like the scent of jasmine. Raising the stakes. So what if there's one dish per day that is special for only that day? You can get it only once a year and you won't be able to try it for the rest of the year. We lead up to it where every single day it's just, here is the day of that dish, and that's all that we say, and it's all that we serve. So love that dish, and it's something to talk about. It's something to feel proud of as well, right? That you can say, oh, I got this, but you won't be able to get it until next year. It's like something you can have over your friends almost. And breaking the script. So fancy restaurants, as I'm sure many of you know, will often give a bite-sized appetizer when you arrive, before you order your food, usually on the house on behalf of the chef is what they say. So what if we did something like serve kangaroo tartare with toasted bread, or another Australian delicacy before the meal? When we mix that up and while you're ordering your food, you don't have to sit there hungry and hoping that we bring you a slice of bread. There's something that comes out from the kitchen, right? So as I said, this is by no means the best ones, but I think they're just different ways that kind of exemplify how we can take some of these principles and distill them down into kind of these like micro moments, if you will, within the experience that seem reasonably attainable. I think something like a scented towel is something that a restaurant very well could do. Let's all assume we're talking post-pandemic at this point. So let's move into moments of insight, right? So moments of insight are defining moments that rewire our understanding of ourselves, of the world. And in a few seconds or minutes, we can realize something about our lives that can influence us for decades, right? And for this section, I've actually opted to take the approach of rather looking at a business to customer point of view, kind of a B2C. I've actually looked more at the relationships that we have with our peers and our stakeholders. And the reason for that is because as service designers, we're usually kind of like the linchpin that sits in between a group of different teams, and we're trying to bring people together, and we're trying to take them along this journey. I would often say that human-centered design and culture change are two sides of the same coin. You can't improve an experience without having people come along the journey with you. And this is something that over the last few years I've started to realize more and more, that any experience, no matter how well designed or how well intentioned, is only as good as the people who deliver it, right? And for many of us, when we are sitting kind of, if you imagine the service blueprint, we're sitting in the back of house. How do we inspire people to then deliver all the way through to the front of house and eventually onto the customer, right? So here's a story from Microsoft Azure about how we can help people around us do what Chip and Dan Heath called trip over the truth, right? So the product manager at Microsoft Azure many years ago knew that they had a really fantastic piece of technology and that it was really going to be something big. However, he had done a bunch of customer research, and what they were getting is some feedback that was saying that the experience was lacking. People were finding it really difficult to learn. The learning curve was very steep. And this product manager had gone to his executives, had gone to solution architects, and gone into road mapping sessions and said, we need to work on the experience. Look at this feedback that we're getting from our customers. And every single time these executives would say, this is actually a technology play. This isn't a novice who's using it. These people are kind of experts. And they ended up opting for technology solutions rather than experience-based solutions. And so the product manager, kind of fed up, knowing that this needed to be addressed, but not really knowing how to convince them with words and customer feedback, decided to hold a 2-day workshop. And on the first day of this workshop, what he did is he brought executives, solution architects, developers, designers, people, anyone who had anything to do with Microsoft Azure, he brought into this workshop. And he got them to split into teams, kind of multidisciplinary teams. And he said to them, the first day of this workshop, all I want you to do is come up with the idea for a company. That's it. Come up with an idea for a company that you love. And on the second day of the workshop, we're going to build it in Azure. And so the first day they do all these activities. People are like, oh, this would be great. Imagine if we did this. This is awesome. And the second day of the workshop, they came in. And I love how he describes in this interview that he says it was a complete disaster. They came in, all of these executives who had never actually used the program before, tried to build an app in Microsoft Azure, and they absolutely failed. And they described that over the course of this workshop, they ended up about halfway through the day resolving that they needed to fix the experience, and they completely rejigged the entire product roadmap so that they could prioritize user experience and user interface design at the very beginning, because there was some very structural things that needed to be fixed. And I just think that this is a really amazing example, because the amount of meetings I've gone into and I've said to people, this is what needs to be done. This is what customers are saying. This is what we're hearing. And they go, yeah, no. They're like, yeah, that's great. But, and Chip and Dan Heath have this amazing phrase, which I love. They say there's this moment that people have when you get them to trip over the truth, but they have this crystallization of discontent, right? It's a moment that you as a person say to yourself, I need to fix this. I kind of think of this a little bit as Inception. It's like, how do we get people to have thoughts of their own? Because then they're really going to own it and they're really going to drive it forward. And this is such a huge part of what we do, is getting the people around us to believe that the experience and the customer are as important as their day-to-day, because sometimes it's really difficult, especially when we're telling somebody that the thing that they've been working on for potentially a number of years is kind of broken and needs to be fixed, right? Another amazing example, this is from another one of their books called Made to Stick, but this is many years ago now, but popcorn used to be popped with animal fat, and it was unbelievably unhealthy. And there was a few separate health departments were trying to get both consumers to stop buying popcorn, because that would then drive the film industry and the cinemas to stop popping it with animal fat in the movies. And they were also obviously trying to get the cinemas to do that themselves. So they came out with this campaign that says, a bag of popcorn contains 30 grams of fat. Now, if you're anything like me, what does a gram of fat look like? You know, like 30 grams of fat. Yeah, I know if they're marketing it, it's probably a lot, but I don't really know what that means. And so they ended up bringing in somebody, actually the person who created the Don't Mess with Texas campaign, which is another amazing case study in how to like reframe a message to get it to resonate with people. But they said, a bucket of popcorn contains more fat than a bacon and eggs breakfast, a Big Mac and fries for lunch, and a steak dinner with all the trimmings combined, right? That holds completely different weight than 30 grams of fat. And it's exactly the same thing. It's just been repackaged in a different way. And so I think this is really interesting, especially like, you know, we're taking these verbatims, we're taking these quotes, we're taking these stories to people, but does it resonate with them? Does the story of that person make them want to change, make the person who's hearing it want to take action? And how can we reframe these stories to the people that we're talking to help them have these moments of insight so that they can resolve to make some of the changes that we know and believe to be the right things to do? A fantastic example of a company who actually does this to a consumer in a slightly different way, but a company who does an amazing job of providing insight to their customers is Spotify, right? Spotify Wrapped is like one of my favorite case studies of all time of how a company can go and say, here's not a pain point because it was never a point to exist with. And let's take the information that we have on our consumers and let's repackage it in a way and send it over to them to provide value. And I think this is really interesting. Like so often, at least when I go into research, people are like, what are all the pain points? And I'm like, yeah, pain points are important, but what do they value? Because what somebody values is really interesting because then you can start to introduce new ideas into an experience instead of just fixing what's there, instead of kind of filling in the pothole. And I'm sure everyone knows, but for those who maybe don't, Spotify Wrapped is obviously at the end of each year, they send you a summary of the type of music that you listen to. You know, like I didn't know that folk was my favorite music until at the end of last year. I also didn't realize that I was in like the top 5% of like Taylor Swift fans, you know, like it's just really funny when you see this and you're like, wow, this company like really didn't need to do this, but they provided this experience to me because they had the data there and they knew that people would find it interesting. It obviously has an amazing impact on their penetration when they release it, because everyone that I know posted on their Instagram, and it puts that brand front of mind. All right. So how can we springboard people to come to realizations of their own? I think this is really like the one key takeaway. How can we, in what we do, whether they be customers or our stakeholders or our peers, springboard people to come to realizations? Because it's so much more powerful when you recognize something on your own terms and in your own way. You provide your own meaning to it. So similar to what we did for the previous exercise for moments of elevation, let's have a think about how we can add insight into the restaurant experience. Again, a couple minutes, if you can, post it in the chat and think about how we can help people learn something when they come to the restaurant. Yeah, the Nando's one's a great example. I think that's very close to one that they use in the book. Yeah, origins of ingredients. Yeah, it's great. I like the most commonly ordered appetizers. I'm the sort of person who goes to a restaurant and asks what I should order when I go there. So whoever came up with that is great. You know, like maybe it's like tables of 6 normally order this combination of things. That would be super useful. Yeah, share an Australian fact. well, you've all pretty much got what I have. So what I'm going to tell you is going to be nothing new. Here's a couple. I've kind of appropriated, again, like some of these from the book. I've taken them and then adapted them for our experience. But what if the restaurant had featured dishes? And as new dishes are brought out, they could tell you the history of where it comes from in Australia and the reason that that dish was invented. I always like to tell the story of an Anzac biscuit, which no American knows. And it's a particular type of biscuit which is associated with the Australian and New Zealand Army. And it has a whole history behind it. And it's specifically eaten at one time of the year. And I've introduced it to so many people in America, and I tell the story and they're like, wow, I didn't realize that a biscuit could have so much history. And like, and so much emotional weight for a nationality, right? Or what about at a table where people were drinking alcohol, a waiter could share a few rules of Australian drinking etiquette, or a drinking song and help them sing along, right? Now, these necessarily aren't things that might change your life, but it could be something that you learned that you didn't know. I think some companies that do things really well in this space are, things like smoking cessation apps, where they give you specific points of data that you mightn't otherwise have thought of. So one of my friends was quitting smoking, and I remember looking at this app and it said, here's how many hours you've spent sitting inside with your friends instead of standing outside at a restaurant or a bar. And I think that's like a really interesting way of like repackaging the same sort of thing and providing information to you that you mightn't have otherwise thought of. And yes, whoever's saying Tim Tam Slams, I'm very happy that you know what those are, because that is an Australian national tradition. So let's head into moments of pride, right? Because this is kind of the third one. So moments of pride are defining moments that capture us at our best. They're moments of achievement, they're moments of courage, and they're things that make us happy to have done the things that we do. So here's a really interesting story from the Red Cross, right? I came home one day and I went to the fridge, and on my fridge, stuck up there, was what looked like to be a newspaper clipping. And I was like, well, that's really interesting, because one, I didn't realize that the person that I lived with even read the newspaper. And two, I didn't realize that they read the newspaper in a physical sense. I've never seen anyone my age do that. Everyone reads on their phone. And I kind of hesitated, and I closed the fridge and I picked it up and I read this newspaper article that said, local hero saves 5 children's lives in Sydney CBD. I was like, what? And I go on to read, and it's a story about how my friend, my housemate, had gone and donated blood, and that blood ended up potentially saving the lives of 5 separate people. And in the story, it had what blood type they were, when they could next donate blood again, information about what was done with the blood and how much it helps. I think this is a really amazing story, because donating blood is something that people do for no reason other than for their own sense of self-pride, right? Like, you really don't get anything out of it. And what I think the Red Cross realized is that, a cookie at the end of donating blood mightn't be enough to get people to remember that event. If you think about it from a peak and a pit and like an end, like the peak end rule, I don't think a cookie is enough to make people like say, oh, I have to go back the next time. So what they did is they ended up setting out this physical post with this kind of interestingly designed novelty newspaper clipping. It had insight in it, because it told you things about other people. It also reminded you what blood type you are, and if you're like me, I always keep forgetting. And it was just a really nice way of creating a peak experience after the fact, once you had recovered from donating that blood. Right? And it had a story about a child who needed an Intagram, and that every few weeks, they have to go and get new blood replaced because of their blood disorder. And they call it their superpowers, because after their treatment, they're strong enough to walk. Like, that's going to make anyone feel proud, And on there, it had the information about how you could then go online and how you could book yourself in to come back in. And I think what they've done there is they obviously recognized that donating blood is like, the reason you do it is because you want to help people, and the feeling that you should feel after that is pride, not tired or discomfort or wiped out when you go back to the office. So what they did is they said, well, how about we just provide them that moment of pride once they had got a little bit better. And I think this is a fantastic example of how how a company can recognize not just a pain point, but start to recognize the emotional value that people are associating with events and then design experiences for it. One that I had actually designed a number of years ago. This is for a life insurer. Unfortunately, I can't say the name of the life insurer. And I was doing some research on the claims payment experience, right? And it's interesting because in this instance, for people who aren't very well versed in life insurance, you have the life insurance company, you have the life insured, which is the end customer at the end of the day. And then in between, you have this broker in most contexts, depending on the distribution model. But you have a broker in most contexts. And this broker is a really important piece of the puzzle because they're the person who mediates or facilitates with the client. They also, in many instances, decide what company the client or the end of the life insured is going to end up buying insurance with based on their experiences with that company in the past. And we were doing this research into the claims payment experience. And we had said to ourselves that digital first or digital by design was our mantra and was our policy, because this company had no legacy. We were building it from scratch. And we went out and we said to these brokers, we're like, all right, so here's the digital interface for how we transfer the money to the people who are receiving the claims payment. What do you think? And they hated it. They despised it. And they're like, no, I always get the insurance company to write a physical check, which in Australia is unheard of. I'd never seen one until I moved to the United States. And they said, I always get them to write a physical check with a personal note. They then send, the insurance company sends that to me. I then drive sometimes hours, like 3 or 4 hours out to people's homes and hand deliver them this check and say, this is the claim that I promised you were going to get if something went wrong. And what we realized is that this claims payment experience was the epitome of why a broker existed in their mind. It was the value prop that they were completely built upon, was the ability to help people who had been affected in pretty serious ways, either someone had passed away or they'd been permanently injured, to be able to get the support that they had been essentially paying for from this company. And so we said, well, what if we don't make this necessarily a digital process? What if we just build on existing behavior? So what we did is we redesigned, and this was kind of an early stage prototype of what we ended up designing, but we redesigned the check so that it wasn't a normal payment check as you imagine it to be. We redesigned it so it was sat on this really nice piece of card. It was beautifully designed. It had some copy that said, we're so sorry for your loss, and here's some support services if you need them. Here's a process that now happens for you to get from the claim that you've made into the payment, or to get the money into your account. And instead of having to go to a bank and actually deposit or cash that check, the life insurance broker can sit with the customer and in front of them take out their phone, scan the QR code, go to a site, and then they can process that payment together. And in the room, the broker can be in charge of that payment going through. And I think this is, for me, like a really interesting learning in understanding the emotional weight that people place on certain events, and not trying to just say, well, let's just go digital by design. Let's just override this experience, because it meant so much. And when we took this to brokers and we kind of showed them this, and they're like, what is it? And we're like, well, scan your phone. And then they're like, oh, I can do this. Like, I can actually be in charge of this. It was the best response I've ever got to any kind of like mid-fidelity prototype I've ever taken. And so with that, again, I'm going to ask you, have a think about that restaurant experience. And if you can, try come up with a couple ideas for how we might make people feel proud for something that they do when they come to the restaurant, or feel a sense of pride. Keep in mind, it doesn't have to be as emotionally weighty as some of those examples, because they're pretty significant. That's like somebody's purpose in their career was predicated on that moment. Yeah, that's great. So donate a portion of the meal donated to wildlife charities and save a kangaroo for every few visits that you do. It's great. All right. Here, as I said, here's one that I've come up with. If you have any ideas, obviously, please keep posting. I'm really interested to hear what anyone thinks of. But what if at the restaurant, similar to what 11 Madison Park in New York City does, where they get restaurant diners to take a quiz and they taste a variety of different types of chocolate that come from different types of animals. Then they have to guess what type of chocolate was associated with what type of animal. So what if our restaurant just adapted that idea and we offered sampler plates from foods of different regions in Australia, or we used different native ingredients and we challenged diners to do the matching. Anyone who nailed all four or whatever combination we need them to do would have their image put up on a wall. Maybe they would get a coupon to bring some friends back another time, or they would just get some swag from the restaurant. Something that just made them feel a sense of pride, something that allowed them, again, to feel, to learn, to have a moment of insight as well in that experience. I love the charity ideas that are coming through in the chat. I think those are fantastic. You know, that's really something that can tie into someone's sense of purpose as well. Something that we're seeing a lot of brands do these days. So moments of connection. Let's get into this. This is our fourth pillar, and then there's a couple other things that I'll talk to you all about, and then we should have some time for questions and all those sorts of things. So moments of connection are moments that are social. They're things like weddings, graduations, baptisms, vacations, work triumphs, speeches, sporting events, any time that you share an experience with other people, you know, and you bring them together. This story is a story from Sharp Healthcare. And Sharp Healthcare is a healthcare system in the West Coast of the United States. And a few years ago, they were having some problems with their patient and staff satisfaction scores, not staff, sorry, customer satisfaction scores. And they needed to find a way to kind of address that within the organization. You can imagine as a healthcare system, there's so many people that are delivering on the experience and kind of the front of house that it's a huge culture change question and a huge culture change problem if it's a problem for you. And so the executive team decided that what they needed to do was bring everyone together. They needed to create this moment of shared meaning. And so what they did is they hosted this huge offsite, something that's probably not going to happen for a long time, but let's keep our fingers crossed. And they hosted this huge offsite, and they brought essentially different cohorts of the business together, because obviously it's a hospital system. You can't just close the hospital. So I had to bring people in different kind of groupings. And they brought patients onto the stage, and they brought staff members, and they brought ELT folk, and they brought industry experts. And they had days where everyone got to know each other and talk to each other. And essentially the executive team stood up at the end and said, our mission is going to be to provide the best patient experience in the United States. And they stood up and said, this is our mission. We're going to ask people to sign up to a series of different kind of volunteer groups that they could start kind of, you know, a grassroots movement to improve the experience. And at the end of this talk, it was a huge moment. Again, if you think about the principles that we've just spoken about, it's raising the stakes, it's boosting sensory appeal, it's providing insight by bringing patients in. You can see that these things start to really blend together in a lot of ways. And they say that at the end of this event, when they stood up and they kind of challenged everyone, they said, you know, come along this journey with us. People were hugging and crying and high-fiving. And then, you know, even the naysayers were saying, yes, let's do something. And they had about 1,600 people sign up to different types of action groups across their health system. And there was a number of different amazing initiatives that spawned off the back of this event, right? So here's one of my favorite ones. A custodian, someone who cleans the rooms, recognized in their daily moving about and cleaning of different rooms that there were some people who came to the hospital who just never had any visitors, and they never had anyone bring them flowers or keep them company. And so what they realized that they could do is not just clean the room, but they could start to speak to these people and to say, hey, how are you going? Now that itself is already a huge bonus. You already have somebody who has, it's not in their job description to make patients feel better if they don't have anyone visiting them, but they've decided to do that because they realize that, you know, you clean a room because you want to provide like a healthy and nice environment for that individual. But it didn't stop there. This custodian one day was leaving the grounds of a hospital, and they noticed that there were some landscapers out in the garden pruning flowers and plants, and they were just maintaining or tending to the garden. And they kind of stopped and they pulled over and they said, hey, what are you going to do with those flowers after you're done cleaning all of this? And they're like, well, we just throw them away. You know, it goes into compost. Like, what do you want? And the custodian said, well, would you mind if I collected them at the end of each day? Could you just put them in one place and I'll come grab them? And from that, what was started was this initiative called This Bud's For You, which now, instead of getting rid of those flowers, they collect them and they give them to people in hospitals who don't have other people visiting them, people who are lonely and alone. And it's just one of those like amazing things that you would never have been able to do that going in like as a blind or like a new party. And I think by bringing people together and by raising the stakes, by breaking the script, by creating shared meaning, people start to want to make a change and they want to make a difference. And so that's just one of those stories that has always, again, really stuck with me as a truly phenomenal way of getting people to kind of come along the journey with us. Another interesting example, and this one's a little bit different. This is about enabling connection. This is a story from Google Maps, and Chip and Dan Heath one day were doing a workshop over at Google, and they were with the Maps team, and they were trying to work out how they could infuse some of these principles into their experience. And they're sitting there and say, well, how do we create connection within Google Maps? And people are coming up with a few different ideas. You know, you can see your friends, you can see other people going, all this sort of stuff. And somebody says, well, you know, the number of words and phrases that you need to actually be able to have the voice assistant be able to recount everything isn't that many. So why don't we all go home tonight and just record our children and family members saying some of those words and phrases, and we'll come in tomorrow and we'll plug it into the application. And they did that. So they went home, some of these developers, and they got their family members, you know, their kids and their partners to record those phrases. And they came in the next day and they plugged it into a beta version of the app. And then they went on a drive. And it's just amazing to hear the stories. They say that as they heard the application saying to them, like, hey, dad, turn left in 1,000 feet. Or like, hey, honey, can you do a U-turn here? They started to have a completely different relationship with what was previously just, you know, a product, a navigation product. And so I think there's some really interesting ways that we can think about, like, if we had to create connection within an experience that we were designing, if we were kind of forced to do it, how would we do it? And then thinking a little bit outside of the box, just being like, all right, we have to provide a moment of connection here. So I'm going to ask you, promise, for the very final time to have a think about our Australian restaurant, and then you can go back to thinking about a real cuisine. And how can we add connection into our Australian restaurant experience? Have a think, again, a minute or two, and just post anything that you can think of in the chat. Yeah, I love both of these already. Handwritten notes from the server and cooks delivering the dishes. I always love when I go to a restaurant and a chef comes out and decides to kind of come and say hi and thanks for coming. So it's kind of a nice moment where you break the barrier between the front and back of house. Oh, I like the mystery box challenge. Bring ingredients for a chef to use. Yeah. Yeah, I like the map where you can post a photo. I think that's really interesting. You often go to, you know, hotels around the world and there's photos of different notes and people have left messages and you feel like you're a part of a traveling community in many ways when you do that. I think it's a nice one. Cool. So here's one that I thought about, which is, what if our restaurant kind of rebranded the idea of a fortune cookie as a friendship cookie, and we include provocative questions inside intended to spark conversation at your table? So you might open up a cookie to find something like, when did you last sing to yourself or to someone else? Or if you could wake up tomorrow and have gained one quality or ability, what would it be and why? And I think this is just like it's an interesting idea of being able to create connection amongst the people in our experience, you know, like if you will, inter-customer connection. Usually when you think about going to a restaurant, by the time you get to kind of the end of a meal, you're really kind of grasping at straws for things to talk about. Like, so the weather, you know, and I think this is just a way of kind of continuing some nice, deep, meaningful conversation and maybe getting to know some people in a way that you mightn't have had a conversation with them before. So what you may have noticed is that these things, these principles are powerful, hopefully, but they're not necessarily exclusive. When you think of really great experiences that you may have had, and many of the things that many of the case studies I kind of presented to you today, many of them are interrelated. Right. And they start to blur the lines and they start to kind of leverage off one another. But as I've said many times, as service designers, we can't do it alone. We are usually a specialist team sitting in the back of house and hoping that somebody in the front of house is going to provide an amazing experience to somebody. It's a lot to ask. You know, it's a lot to ask of somebody to think about how they can do something like that. You know, there's a story of a couple who goes into a bank to open up a joint bank account. And they're speaking to the teller, and the teller says, "Why are you opening a joint bank account?" They say, "Oh, you know, we're getting married." The teller's just making polite conversation with them. The couple open up the joint bank account and they leave. That would have been a pretty good experience in the first place. You know, you get in, you get out, it's frictionless. But afterwards, the teller goes online and they find the couple's wedding registry and they buy a present on behalf of the bank. And I think it's just a really amazing example of like, that's something that somebody has done on their own accord. And obviously every organization is kind of scared of that in many ways, because how do you start to break that down and allow everyone to start to feel as though they can contribute to the experience in that way? So I'm interested, what do you all think is more important in encouraging teamwork? Purpose or passion? Comment on the chat quickly. Yeah. Most of you are right, which is great. So purpose, and I think it's because purpose is something that we can share, right? And it knits people together. Now, we can be aligned under a similar purpose, but each one of us might have a different passion that we can contribute towards that, you know? And so I think a lot of this comes down to, at the end of the day, is what how Chip and Dan Heath say it is, how do we decentralize service excellence? How do we take it from something that we care about to something that everyone cares about? You know, and I think this is a real fundamental part of being a service designer, is making it accessible to everyone. I've seen some really amazing examples. You know, VW came out with this thing, which is 101 ways that you can improve the experience. And there was actually something that they gave to their associates, their dealers, which aren't even actually VW employees, if you understand how automotive kind of works. It's not even their employees, but they gave it to them because they wanted these people to understand 101 ways. And why 101? Because the kind of CMO of VW Australia says, because there's always something more that you can do. There's always one more thing that you can do to make it a better experience. And they handed out these little pamphlets and books that just sit in someone's back pocket. And so, and so how do we do that? You know, there's an amazing story from Nordstrom, and this is again like a fantastic example of encouraging people to not be afraid of autonomy, or brands to not be afraid of autonomy. A lady is in Nordstrom one day and she's walking down an escalator and her heel gets caught. She ends up kind of stumbling and falling over and breaking her heel. a clerk runs over to her and says, "I'm so sorry that just happened. Please sit down." The lady's a little bit shaken. She goes and she picks up the shoe and the heel's broken off. So the clerk walks over, gets a pair of slippers and gives it to her and says, "Put these on, continue shopping around. I'm going to go down to the shoe department and see if there's anything that we can do." The clerk then returns a few minutes later and she's holding a box. And she says, "We couldn't fix your heel, but I looked around." And she opens up and she goes, "These shoes are the same size, they're a similar style, and they're on the house." And in this interview, the interviewer says to this lady who's broken a shoe, she goes, or they go, "Where do you buy those shoes now?" And this person goes, "My shoes, where do I buy everything?" It's like, it's these moments, it's these things that are like, it's only a clerk or an assistant could have done that. There's almost no way as a designer, as a service designer, that we can make them do that, but we can set up the guardrails and the infrastructure to allow them to do it. And I think that's one thing that's really interesting, is like, policies should be something that are really front of mind. Company policies should be something that are really front of mind for us, because they really determine how people are able to interact and engage with customers. And the more autonomy we can provide without exposing our brand to reputational risk, which is always the pushback that you're going to get, is ideal. And there's this huge call out in Chip and Dan Heath's book, which just says, beware of reasonableness, because there's always going to be the person who comes in with the voice of reason, and that we should continuously be looking for ways to come up with ideas that maybe aren't reasonable. And I think that's kind of one thing that's really interesting. A quote I wanted to kind of leave you all with. This isn't the very final thing. It's a little bit wordy, so I'm going to leave it on the screen for a few minutes, a few moments. But a moment of shared meaning instills not the pride of an individual accomplishment, but the profound sense of connection that comes from subordinating ourselves to a greater mission. Very lofty for a Tuesday night, I know. But I think it's one of these things, it's a really, really powerful quote. That the feeling of pride, the feeling of connection that you get from doing something that is a part of a greater mission, a greater purpose, the feeling that you get when you support people around you, I think is exceptionally strong. And the more that we can encourage people to do that and then celebrate those wins, I think the more successful we're all going to be as designers working in whatever context that we're designing, right? So when you go to work tomorrow, think to yourself, or whatever you do tomorrow, how can you deliver experiences that are as memorable as sign-up day, the trial of human nature, or even breaking your shoe in Nordstrom, right? And what I hope this talk has kind of provided to you is that it's not about necessarily green fields, blue sky, or going so far out of a box that you forget that there was a box in the first place. What I hope that these principles do is give you the tools to create memorable experiences without having to break the status quo. Now, I don't necessarily think going into companies or even to your companies and saying, let's make cars fly is what's gonna get attention and really improve the experience. I think it's just about applying these principles at specific moments. And I think that's what I loved about this when I read this book, is that I could actually use this. I went into that life insurance company and I used this. I was reading this book at this time, and that's kind of what inspired me to come up with that idea of like the physical check that then was transacted with a digital QR code or by digital means, right? So ask yourself, what does your experience naturally afford? What principles do you think you can apply? And then how can you create a peak moment? Because not all experiences are the same. Not every experience needs pride. Not every experience needs connection. But I think every experience needs one of them at least, if not more, as you saw by a few of those examples. So my recommendation is target one specific moment, maybe a break point if you want to kind of go down the service recovery route, maybe just something that you think has a lot of opportunity but isn't a break point, is something that people aren't even really talking about, but you think you can turn it into kind of a signature or ownable experience for your company, and raise it from good to great. Just do one thing that you think is going to put a smile on a customer's face. rather than removing friction. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, comments, anything like that, that's what we're here for.
Thank you. It was amazing. Yeah, maybe I can just have a comment. I think you made a point on like distributing the responsibilities of service designers, and how can we really empower people that work on the ground to really deliver those experiences. I think that's a super powerful thing to think about. Oftentimes we do service design and we don't design services. So that's sometimes how I frame this. It's like we work in a white box, on journey maps and blueprints, but then going really operational and really sort of empower the people that deliver the service is crucial to actually design them, right? So I guess that's just a comment. I know I also don't have like a perspective on how to do that, but I think it's super important. I really love that you touched on that.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested in the culture change aspect of what we do, I would recommend there's a book called Lean Change Management. That's a really good book just to think about how we can start to make change. So much of this is running up against ingrained skepticism for the programs that we're running. So often companies try roll things out and they've, I've seen it all before. I've been here for 10 years. I've seen us try to do this in the past. And what lean change management starts to do is it says, well, let's pick one thing. Let's get a win. As I would say in Australia, let's get a run on the board, which is a cricket analogy that nobody gets. but let's get a small win and let's start to like build from that, right? And I think that's a really important point and a really great book as a kind of a jumping off point.
That's cool.
Hi, I had a comment. It's Aurelia. Hi, everybody. Antonio, what I was thinking about was similar to what you were saying, was empowering the individuals in this ecosystem. Having worked in retail, and wouldn't I love to do something nice for a customer like that, or even working at a restaurant, I've been there too. Sometimes the individual contributor to the whole experience is really not empowered. So I'm glad you mentioned that book for the lean change management, because it really has to be, it really has to be something that comes from the top down, that they really are going to change their system, because otherwise you can't have individual people changing those experiences that way.
Yeah.
How do you think about getting around the, one of the things I ran into a lot in my last job was well, this is how we've always done it mentality. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality. How do you, what are some strategies that you use to get around that when trying to bring some of this change into organizations?
I think it's actually a really interesting question, because I was even speaking about this in the company that I work at the other day as an example. And a lot of the time you're asking, keep in mind, a lot of the time what we're asking people to do is to do something sometimes for us, not necessarily for them. They don't see the benefit in themselves. And so the first part of this is, I would say, is there an opportunity to provide value to the people who you're working with? Those people who are a little bit skeptical, who are saying this is how things are always being done. What if you hosted a workshop that was just called "That's Not How Things Are Done" day? Just an entire workshop that just said this is not how things are done. So every single time you run into something which someone says, "Oh yeah, that's just how we do it," you're like, well, what if it wasn't like that? What if we did this for you? And you can start to get them thinking like different ways of thinking about change. The other way, obviously, is, and this is a very like standard kind of way of describing things, is that change is only effective when it's top down and bottom up, right? So you need coverage from the people above to be able to say, this is what we're doing. That's why that Sharp Healthcare example was so powerful, because the CEO stood up and said, this is what I'm going to do to start changing, and you can all hold me accountable to it. But the other thing is that you need on the ground level, as I said, we need to start as designers showing people that change is going to happen and showing people the impact that has, and being able to like effectively or properly prioritize what project you're going to work on, what type of project you're going to work on when you're moving into a new part of a business, I think is a really powerful tool to have in your toolkit. And knowing how to pick the right type of project. I've often in the past I put up sliders, and I say like, you have a problem that is really complex or really simple, and you have a team that is huge and small, and you have something that's going to earn the business a lot of money or a little bit of money, and what you almost want is to find, as you move those sliders, the right combination, of like, you want a problem that's complex enough that you're going to be able to create a case, a proof point on it, but you don't want it to be on a team that's too large, because then you're not going to be set up to succeed. I think a lot of the time it's about thinking like, what are the attributes of a type of project that you would want to see? What's essentially your perfect service design project? And then sit with people and be like, all right, this is what we want, and this is why we want to do it.
Yeah, if I can build up on that, David, I think one of the way, I think I love the idea of the workshop of like, I was in like the workshop about things are not done in this way. In that workshop, I would also add a moment where you think about what's the cost of not doing it. Because like you are in the room for a reason, right? So somehow you go in the room and discussing, service design approaches, human-centered approaches that might be different, but somehow you are there. So there is someone that wants you there, and someone else that maybe have resistance to that, also eventually for good reason. But like, if you start thinking, okay, what's the cost of not doing that? Then you have sort of like some sort of metric not metric, but point of reference. And then you start having a more rich conversation around opportunities. That's what I do with my clients, and I talk from an agency perspective. So maybe now it's a bit different, but I think it's a good strategy. I saw this strategy during the scoping phase done by a lot of colleagues, and it's always like a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'd build on that. One thing I'd love to do, and to your point, is say, not how much is this going to cost you, but how much could it save, or how much value could it bring to your organization. The other thing just to build in that is, so often these projects have secondary value besides what it does to your P&L, what it does to NPS, those sorts of things, like what it does in terms of introducing another department in a large organization to what you do, what it does to potentially providing a case study for your key client to be able to stand on stage and talk at an event. Like there's actually all these like really interesting like secondary benefits that can come from projects, and sometimes those can be really powerful things to especially if you have a good partnership and a good relationship. I work in a client context, so those are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about, is how do I build those up, and a lot of the time it's just about how do you make someone look good. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make my client look good within their business, and having conversations around those different ways that you can do that. So yeah, it can be really powerful.
So I was really blown away by that one of the first slides you had, over the 15 minutes versus the 2 hours. Do you think it's even worth building experiences for the people who are taking 2 hours of your life? Like, should we just be building for the people who we know are open to this?
Yeah, I would actually say, like, I would be building experiences for the ones, because those are the people who are going to become serious detractors. That's where kind of service failure is happening. And look, you never want to design a service that's going to have serious flaws in it. Like that's not, as empathetic in people, we don't want anyone going through that. It's actually more kind of like the neutrals that I'm like, all right, you're not that engaged with the brand. You're going through this, you're kind of happy. So I would be focusing effort on your your kind of loyalists and the people who really love you, and the people who are sitting down the bottom, because no one wants to dislike a brand that much. They're only disliking a brand that much because something's gone wrong. And
I deal with old people, so they're very very happy to be crotchety and complain a lot. So.
So yeah, I would say like it's actually the neutrals that aren't worth considering. You know, always consider them, but just for the purpose of this talk, obviously, I would say like try focus on making your loyalists really loyal and engaging in service recovery.
Cool.
You mentioned something that I've been working on for a while, which in relation to the Nordstrom story, that you want to set up the environment for people to be able to react to sort of those extreme situations and capitalize on that in response to the heel breaking. In the extreme Six Sigma lean world that we live in, where everything is heavily documented and rigid processes are set up and people are kind of set in motion, these patterns, how do you reconcile the following a script versus breaking script and having the latitude to create novelty?
I think you need to, it's kind of two parts. So one, I think, I don't know from a Six Sigma standpoint how you would reconcile it in the back end in terms of what it actually does to the experience. I'm not too well versed in Six Sigma. But what I'd say is like in encouraging people to have the runway to do that and the ability to do that. And a large part of that comes from educating them about what people value and what they're going through and what's happening in their journey, right? Because a lot of the times you can be sitting in an organization and you're kind of dealing with people in a particular moment, but understanding what they're coming in with, what baggage they're coming in with, and then where they're going afterwards, I think can be really, really helpful. One example I've had in the past working at a general insurance company is that they lost a $7 million account over $200. It's one of the biggest, it's a huge account for them because one of the call center operators wasn't able to pay somebody a $100 discount on an account that they had, even though they spent $7 million with the company. And so what they did after this story, because they took this all the way up to their general management, is that they said, we need to have essentially like a leeway, or I think it was $150 or $200 leeway that these contact center operators could then essentially do whatever they needed to do with it, because they realized that the cost of giving them that money was actually going to net out over time to reduce their losses of high value accounts. And this was just obviously one example of that. So yeah, just in terms of that, I hope I answered your question, but in terms of that, that was one way I've seen a brand start to like decentralize service excellence a little bit.
That makes sense. Thank you.
We had some questions in the chat as well about poor service design experiences or failures, if people are feeling shy. Yeah, there was a question around, do you have examples of service design failures or a list of what not to do when thinking about service design?
Well, this is now becoming like more of a preference. I think having really high, especially when you're talking about contact center operators, having really highly specialized teams that aren't really able to do much, that then eventually just bounce you around to different units because they aren't empowered to do anything themselves, can be really frustrating. I actually got asked the other day, just to that point, you know, would you have this call center team, or would you have this sales team internal or third party or kind of offshore? And I said, well, I would highly recommend, because it is kind of a consultative sale, it's a complex product. I was like, you might be able to triage offshore, but you pretty quickly need to get people to those who can actually start to solve problems, complex problems pretty quickly. And I think a lot of the time service failure is just from having more lower skilled operators can end up just creating a lot more frustration. It may seem like it is more like efficient in many ways, but efficiency doesn't always lead to satisfaction or to creating love or great experiences.
I think to add to that, something to not do is put one particular audience way far above another one. And when you're thinking about service design, looking at it as a larger system of really an ecosystem of different groups together. And when you put one audience way far above there, it's a series of trade-offs. So what are you doing to the other groups within the system that is to support just this one group? So just something that made me think of that in the question. So thank you for asking.
It's a good question. It is a really good question, whoever answered it. So I'll definitely have a think about it. I think it's a good thing to think about what not to do sometimes. Cool. Awesome. Well,
not a question so much as a comment. I know that's everyone hates that. No, I just wanted to say that this talk has already got me thinking about a couple of scenarios that I'm working through with a client. And so I'm just grateful for the inspiration. And I don't know if it's directly service related or more strategy related, but it's got my brain going. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, I really liked all the stories.
Yeah.
It was a good time.
Almost all those stories are like widely accessible online and through those specific books as well. Like that's a very small subset of the stories that are in the book. So I would highly recommend trying to get your hands on it and reading it. They write in such an interesting and engaging way. Especially like Chip and Dan Heath, and the If Disney Ran Your Hospital book, I think is just such an interesting case study, and it really starts to get into how you can motivate people. Not all of us work so closely to, that work on a day-to-day basis, but I think for those who do, it's, it's such an important part of your job is being able to inspire people to want to deliver those experiences and to keep them engaged. So. I highly recommend getting into them and drawing out your own insights from them, because there's so much more in there. Cool. Anything else?
I can make a comment. It's Aurelia again. What you said about what draws people together, passion or purpose, that I will use because I am trying to bring together some colleagues for a giving back initiative. Mm-hmm. And I screenshot that slide, and I will probably try to push it through to my boss, even though we're in lockdown. I think there's still a lot of good that we can do as a group of colleagues. And I want to, and everyone says team building is great, blah, blah, blah. But I really do believe that purpose, it brings people together better than bowling or something like that. But so I want to thank you for that. I'm going to use it this week in presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just so true when you think about it in your day-to-day life. There's, you might love to do one thing, somebody else in your team might like to do another thing, but you're all working towards, if you're working towards a common goal, you don't mind picking up some extra work or doing something on top of that, just so that you can kind of all drive towards a common goal. So especially right now, you know, there's so many big problems that we can try solve, that getting people together and starting to think about it, I think it's a nice way of starting to bring together different teams.
Hi, you mentioned some examples of service design failures, but are there, I don't know, pitfalls or like things to know or avoid if we think, I don't know, it could be leading to a bad design, thinking we are creating something memorable?
In terms of, I was actually thinking about this because I think it's a fantastic question. I think one of the big pitfalls, and I would call out, is assuming that the customer wants anything. It's like assuming that any of us or anyone who you're speaking to in a company knows what the customer wants without actually just going out and speaking to a couple people yourself. And this is one thing that I've been pushing really hard on, is to make sure that before we do anything, we ask people, even if it means going on Reddit or Twitter or Facebook and just asking a question and seeing what sort of response that we can get. In terms of creating memorable experiences, I think memorable signature experiences are many times difficult to create because, you know, companies are always vying for our attention. And I'd say that's why these principles are kind of really useful, because you can use them and just try to do something small. Oftentimes, you know, people try to go too big too quickly. You know, they try to create the thing that everyone and every brand's going to talk about. And from a lot of those examples, you can see it's actually just like really small micro moments that can stand out in people's minds, because that's when they actually have the capacity to think about it and to invest into it. Asking too much of customers is usually the biggest pitfall, I'd say, because people are just so overwhelmed.
We have the $1 million question. What measurement criteria do you use to measure the success of service design?
So the way that I talk about it is there's a few different things in terms of measurement. If you think about, I often talk about it as a triangle, right? So you have at the very bottom, you have your touch point metrics. A level above that, you have journey or value metrics. And then above that, you have brand level metrics. You should really only have one brand level metric, but companies like to mix and match and usually add a couple depending on what department and what division they're in. And so I would say when you're talking about touch point metrics, there we're talking about your more traditional types of things like engagement, interaction. You know, these are usually from operational data, but it could also be from it could also be solicited data. And so that's kind of your measurement model. So you want to have touch point metrics, journey metrics that you're measuring at the end of a certain type of flow, like an onboarding flow or a purchase flow or a claims flow, as an example. And then you want to have your one brand level metric, and you should be asking a series of, you know, usually like a touch point, a journey, and a brand in each survey that you may be sending out. And then there's 3 types of data that you include. So it's like solicited, unsolicited, and operational. So solicited is a survey, unsolicited is any sort of social listening that you can do, Facebook groups, anything, Google reviews, anything like that. And then try to bring in operational data. So in terms of measuring, it's just about working out within your experience, like when you think about that journey metric, right? What's the type of value that you want to provide? There's your usual suspects. We want people to feel valued. We want them to feel informed. We want them, you know, it to be transparent. We want them to feel understood, all those sorts of things. But go out and speak to customers and find out, what do you want to feel at the end of a journey? And then start to measure your experience so that you're saying, are we actually delivering that? But then so that we can see how certain touch points are performing, you then have that, and then you have your brand level metric that can sit across different journeys, and you can use as a benchmarking tool against other companies. So that's kind of like the model that I use. And then the way that I often talk about it is like, how does a company listen, learn, and act on feedback, right? So there's kind of like 3 things that you're doing. You're listening to your customer. You're then embedding feedback loops within your organization to how you're learning from it, and then what do you actually do from that? And usually the act part is what's forgotten. And that is what, at least for me, frustrates, because I always give feedback because I feel like I should as a designer. And then I know that if I give like a 1 on a survey, that I should be contacted by a company. That's like best practice, right? That's service recovery. But I'm never contacted. And so there's some things within that, which is to make sure that you're acting when someone's actually going out of their way to give you feedback. Make sure that you're recognizing that they've done that, either just by thanking them or by contacting them if their experience was kind of substandard or subpar. Yeah, hopefully that answered it. That's one of my favorite things, because I love doing qualitative research, but I'm like, wait, we could be doing always on qualitative research if you just set up a proper measurement program, right? Like that's the thing. And then you can use real face-to-face qualitative research to do things like customer testing, and it can be used to kind of generate or find stories that are going to be used in some of those meetings that you may be having with execs, to be like, listen how bad this person's experience was. Like, imagine if this was you. And you can use it for trying to create experiences that are going into new territory. But when you're looking to improve, kind of measure baseline and improve current state, I think looking at establishing proper measurement programs can be probably the best way of making sure that everyone's thinking about it and always doing it.
Did you not say earlier though that companies spend like way more time on the 1 ratings versus the 4 or 5 star ratings?
Yeah.
And so how do you, I don't know, if you're getting, personalized calls back, that seems like that's a lot more work and time spent towards that than,
So I mean, best practice, especially if you're looking at kind of like NPS or satisfaction feedback handling, is that 1s and 2s you actually do contact by like a team lead will physically contact somebody and see what's happening there. As I said to, I can't remember who was, somebody else on the call, I'd actually say it's really kind of that neutral range that I think too much time is spent on. The breakpoints, the 1s and 2s, they actually need to be addressed fundamentally. For the purpose of the talk, I was just obviously pointing towards how beneficial it can be to focus on the 6s and the 7s. If anyone has any questions that come up at any other point in time, obviously you can feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or anything like that. Just shoot me a message. More than happy to nerd out with people. I love these questions, and I love connecting with all you guys. So I'm sure I'll see you at other meetups, if not until then. And I hope you all stay safe. Enjoy the fake spring that we have in New York for the next couple of days. And yeah, thank you for joining. It was really nice.
Thank you, John, so much. The recording will be available. We'll send that out through Meetup. Check out our YouTube. But thank you so much, John, for coming and speaking to us with all your wisdom. And everyone, be safe. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. I'll close the Zoom.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.